Right now, I'm going to introduce somebody to you who is a global thought leader. Now, I'm not going to read her bio out because it would take up the whole of her session. She has so many accomplishments in this field of thought leadership. She's a global thought leader. I'm a thought leader in my household, or at least I thought I was until my wife said that nobody was interested in what I was thinking. So I've just let it go at that. But Rachael Botsman is a global thought leader, and she's going to talk to us today about something that we all probably know about, we're aware of, but if we're over 17, probably don't understand very well. And that's the sharing economy, how social networking and how social trends are changing so rapidly. So to talk to us about the sharing economy and how it's disrupting markets, I'd like to introduce to you right now, and I'm very excited to, Rachael Botsman. Come on up here, Rachael.
Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here this morning, and I'm particularly excited to speak to this audience. I don't say that to every audience, I promise, because you guys really sit at the intersection of technology and human behavior, and that is one of my passions. Today, I am going to talk to you about the sharing economy, but I actually call it the collaborative economy, so it's ironic that you use that in the introduction, and I will talk a little bit about why there is a difference. And where I'd like to start is to get a sense of how much you all might be already interacting or trying some of these services. So I'm going to start with some of the names that you have probably heard of. So I'd like you to raise your hand if you have used Uber. So about 30 people. Is anyone a host or has been a guest on Airbnb? Again, around 30 people. Has anyone borrowed or lent money on the peer-to-peer lending platform Society One? One person. Just one other question, just to get a sense of the early adopters. Does anyone own or trade Bitcoin? One person sheepishly putting up their hand. We're not going to come and steal your Bitcoin. It's okay. Great. That just gives me a sense of how much you're engaging. So what I'm going to do today is explain how these ideas that look quite different are actually connected by this idea called the collaborative economy. I'm then going to explain why it's transforming different sectors from banking to transportation to retail incredibly fast, and what makes some areas prone to disruption. And then the third piece is why this represents, to me, such an interesting new era of customer experiences. Because this is an era where the customers are also the providers controlling the user experience within these marketplaces. Now, I know John is following me, so I thought I'd actually start to try and explain what exactly the collaborative economy is by going with the roots of the godfather, as I call it, or the grandfather of this space, and that is, in fact, eBay. Now, many of you may have heard that there is a legend that exists that eBay first started to help Pierre Midier help his girlfriend buy and sell Pez dispensers. Did you ever have those as a child? They were like those, I loved them, they were like sweet candy things. Now, this is in fact a complete myth. And it was a myth, I believe, made up by the marketing department at eBay because the true story they decided was too geeky. The true story was this, in that Pierre decided to do a little bit of an experiment. So he put a broken laser pointer up for auction on a website that he had. And he did it as a test to see if there was anyone in the world who would bid on this laser pointer. And even he was amazed when someone bid, I think it was around $13.83. So he wrote to the guy and he said, "You do realize that this laser pointer is broken?" And the bidder wrote back and said, "I am a collector of broken laser pointers." Now, I'm not just saying this because eBay is here. They were a visionary company because what they saw in its very early stages were the two ingredients that are at the foundation of the collaborative economy. And these two ingredients are how technology creates the efficiency to match millions of haves with millions of wants in ways on a scale that's never been possible before. And what we're starting to see is how this dynamic can transform supply and demand, particularly in areas of our life where supply and demand is broken or there's friction. But what Pierre also saw was how technology would create a greater revolution. And that is a transformation in the way that we can trust people. So how technology would start to create this social glue for trust to form between strangers. And it's these two ingredients of efficiency and trust that are at the basis of the collaborative economy. Now, you will hear this get called many different things, and I'll explain a little bit why. But just to give you a clear economic principle that is at the basis of ideas such as Airbnb and Uber, this is how I think about it. It's basically a system that activates the untapped value or untapped potential of underutilized assets. Now, those assets can be stuff, they can be broken laser pointers, they can be spaces, they can be time, they can be skills, they can be utilities, they can be money. And they take these assets and they put them into collaborative models and marketplaces in ways that enable greater efficiency and greater access. So if you're looking at it through an economic lens, that's the common principle that ties these ideas together. If you look at it through a behavioral lens, what's starting to happen is that customers are swapping, they are renting, they're lending, they're bartering, they're trading, and they are sharing in ways that are being reinvented for the Facebook age. Now, the reason why I don't use the term the sharing economy is sharing is just one behavior that's starting to happen in this broader collaborative ecosystem. Now, the funny thing for me is that how fast this space has grown. When I wrote my book, which is now almost 5 years ago, it was an incredibly lonely time. Just to share with you, like when you write a book, you get your cell slips in, and any writer will tell you, you get that first slip in and you look at it anxiously. And I got mine in, and I was in London, and I remember I was sitting with my grandma, and we were having a cup of tea, and I opened it up, and it said that I had sold 12 copies. And so I wrote an email to the publisher, and I said, are you sure there aren't some zeros missing on this? And she said, no, people don't really get what it's about. And my grandma was laughing because she said, well, I bought 6, so you've actually only sold 6 copies. And this is a true story because I think what happened in the early days that people thought it was just about garage sales and secondary markets of stuff, and it was a little bit hippy-dippy. And so the commercial potential of this space has only really just become evident. Just to give you a sense of some numbers so you can see the scale, it's estimated that in April, in the United States alone, $800 million was invested in startups in this space. That's in the US in 1 month alone, $800 million. The British government are a little bit worried about this. They're worried from a tax perspective. You know, how do you tax revenues that are generated off existing assets? So they commissioned a study, and they were astonished to discover that within the next 5 years, it's estimated that 15% of the GDP will come from collaborative models and marketplaces. So this isn't a niche trend. This isn't a startup idea. This is a systematic change around business, how business will run. So what happened for me is a couple of years ago, I started to get a little bit obsessed as to why were certain sectors getting disrupted really fast. So why were we seeing a lot of innovation in transportation and hospitality? And I had this feeling that finance was coming next. And so what I did was I wanted to look at this through the lens of the customer. So I looked at 500 different companies across 30 countries and basically tried to identify what are 5 common pain points that the customer experiences that makes it right for reinvention in their lives. And I did this really as an exercise and was amazed to discover that there were actually 5 common root causes of disruption, or 5 areas that made something particularly vulnerable. And I'm going to go into what each of these are. So the first is complex experiences. So when the customer experiences complex experiences. The second is waste. The third is broken trust. The fourth is redundant intermediaries. And the fifth is limited access. So now what I'm going to do is explain what each of these are. So let's look first at redundant intermediaries. So this is when the customer experiences layers of intermediaries. Now, intermediaries can be people, so the middlemen, or they can be processes that ultimately don't add value to the end product or service. And in these areas, what people are realizing is that they can actually remove the middlemen and directly get what they need or want from each other. Now, one of the areas that we're seeing a lot of innovation around is professional and local services. So rather than agencies and lots of middlemen, people are getting directly what they need from each other. So I'm going to tell you a story about a fast-growing startup in this space. And the reason why I've chosen this story is because recently they made a fundamental pivot in their customer experience strategy. So this is a company called Startup, where did that come from? TaskRabbit. And it was started by Leah Buskey, and this is her dog, Kobe. And Kobe is the inspiration for the company. Because what happened was Leah and her husband were living in Boston at the time. I've lived in Boston. It's freezing cold. They were waiting for a cab to take them out for dinner. The snow was coming down, and they got into an argument, as couples do, because no one had fed the dog. And no one had fed the dog because they ran out of dog food. So they got into this argument, it ruined their evening, and they decided to stay home. And they started, their software programmers, they started to think about how ridiculous this problem was. Because someone in their neighborhood must have been in the pet store at that time willing to run the errand for them. Now, Leah started thinking she couldn't get this idea out of her head. At the time, she was a programmer at IBM. And she started thinking about a really interesting concept. And this is the concept of how social networking will become service networking. So how will we start to use these connections, this online trust that exists in platforms like Facebook and LinkedIn, and use that to get things done in the real world in our daily lives? So when TaskRabbit first launched, it functioned like eBay for errands. So let me give you an anecdote. There's a similar platform, I should say, in Australia called Airtasker. And Airtasker works in this model. So last weekend, I was at a 3-year-old's birthday party, and it was coming to the end of the party, and I could see my friend, the wife, her face was just, she was stressed. She was stressed because of the mess. Her house had been ruined by these 33-year-olds, that her husband had decided it was a great idea to do this massive party. And so I said to her, why don't you post it on Airtasker and we'll see what happens. So she posted, need someone to clear up, third birthday party, complete chaos, and they watched the bids come in. So this is what happened. You post a task, the bids come in, and then my friend Lauren made a selection based on the price of the tasker, the person who was willing to clean up her house, but also the online reputation. So this worked for a while for TaskRabbit, and they started to see tasks that they expected being posted, and people like Lauren getting, someone came around to her house within 10 minutes, and they started to see things like moving and picking up groceries and doing the cleaning. And then, excuse me, this amazing thing happened where they started to see this huge diversification on the platform. So this is just one weird example. I think it's weird. Someone's bought a new mattress. I called this guy because I thought it was so strange. He has a bad back. He can't sleep on a firm mattress. He needed someone to jump on it for 2 hours. So he posted it on TaskRabbit and basically said, you can come round and jump on my mattress, and you can even pet my cats, and I'll give you beer. Now, 15 people bid on this task. So zoom out and think what's happening here. Think about that slide I showed at the beginning. It's pretty incredible how you can find someone directly to do whatever you need them to do. It's creating a marketplace for things that never had a marketplace before. Now, the interesting thing that happened on TaskRabbit is user volume was doubling quarter on quarter. The number of tasks going up was doubling quarter on quarter. The diversification of tasks was going up. Everything looked great if you look at the numbers. But there was one piece of data that was wrong, and that was conversion. Completion of tasks was dropping. And along with completion of tasks was dropping, so was user satisfaction. So they started to look into this, and this really interesting piece of insight emerged, is that what they discovered is that for all the talk of an open marketplace, people actually wanted a consistent and controlled experience. They wanted to know who would do the task, how much it would cost, and when it would be completed. So they've recently changed their model so that when you post a task, the platform dynamically matches you with a range of taskers. It still gives you a spread, so you can pick an experienced tasker, what they call a super rabbit. They really are called super rabbits. You can experience John, or you can pick Ethan, who's new to the platform. And I think this is really interesting how initially when these ideas start forming, many customers will say, I want it to be open, I want it to be free, but what they're actually looking for is quite a controlled and curated customer experience. The other interesting thing that they discovered through their user insight was they made the assumption that once someone had been matched, so once you had matched a tasker with the client, they assumed that they would go into their own communication platform. So they would start using email and they would start using messaging, but that's not what they wanted them to happen. So they've just built this whole interesting ecosystem of communication tools because people said that they wanted to stay within the TaskRabbit ecosystem. Now, this sets up a really important dynamic that I know John's going to dive deeper into, and it's really where I think it becomes interesting from a customer experience perspective. It's because if you think about what's happening here, we're entering this new age where customers are also providers. They are also the people completing the tasks. And then you have the platforms in the middle. And it's the job of the platforms to continually innovate to improve these ingredients, so to continually make it more efficient and more safe and seamless for this direct connection to happen. So it's this weird tension where they have to create the innovation to essentially get out of the way of the exchange. And I can tell you there is a massive opportunity to innovate within this ecosystem. The platforms are having to develop these tools because they don't exist. So how you actually start to innovate to remove the friction around these direct exchanges becomes really, really interesting. Now, the other thing that's interesting is that it's not just startups operating in this platform space. So this is a platform that I saw launch about a year ago, and it's a similar principle to TaskRabbit where they're looking at on-demand staffing. And I discovered that it was actually Coca-Cola behind this platform called Guanolo. Now, what Coke realized was that temporary, so hourly labor or daily labor, is very expensive for many big brands. It's where they pay lots of agencies and middlemen. So they've built this incredible platform where you can now post, I need Coke stocked on these shelves, and have direct access to this whole pool of labor. So these major brands are starting to now think about how they can provide the platform role to connect people directly with what they need without layers of middlemen in between. So let's look at the next big area of opportunity. So this came up where customers were talking about limited access. So these are products or services that they can't or don't want to access due to price, convenience, or availability. Now, this can be something like higher education, because people can't afford to go to university or they can't actually go there, which is why you're seeing the rise of sort of massive open online courses. But it also applies to goods that we don't necessarily need to own. We only need limited access to. And cars is one of the fastest growing categories in this space. So if you think about car ownership, it doesn't make sense. It's the second highest household expense, and yet the average car sits idle for 23 hours a day. Now, we have a whole generation that's growing up where ownership of a car is not the holy grail. And this really interesting study was recently done in Germany to look particularly into these behaviors, and they found something fascinating. They said to 18 to 24-year-olds, you can either own your smartphone or you can own a car. 75% chose the smartphone. Now, for me, this research is so interesting because what's starting to happen is the smartphone is no longer a communications tool. It's a remote control to access things in the physical world. So the car companies are starting to wake up that the future of their cars isn't selling business. the future of their cars is in generating open models of access. So in the same way, the newspaper companies realize that they can't be tied to the physical delivery system of a newspaper, all of a sudden car companies and automotive are starting to say, maybe our future is in collaborative mobility. So I'm just going to introduce you to one that's been developed by BMW. They've launched in Hamburg and San Francisco, and this really represents the next wave of car sharing coming along, where you don't need to own the car, you can pay to access it. So I'm going to show you a quick video that explains how this works.
Welcome to Drive Now, a completely new car-sharing service, brought to you by BMW i, Mini and Sixt. True to its name, Drive Now gives you access to a car in the city wherever and whenever you need it. And leave behind with the same flexibility. Personal mobility has never been easier, without the need of owning a car and without any base fees. Sign up is simple. Register for the service with your driver's license at one of our stations. You'll receive an electronic sticker which will turn it into your car key from then on. Through the Drive Now app on your mobile phone or website, you can locate a car near you and reserve it. Or if you spot a Drive Now car on the street, see if it's free and jump in that instant. Open the door with your driver's license, enter a PIN code, and you're ready to go. Drive freely at a reasonable price billed by the minute. Fuel is included. And when you're done, check out with a click and leave the car anywhere you want. Parking within the city is free. Personal mobility has never been easier. Find and drive. That's premium car sharing. Drive Now.
So the bit that often surprises people is that you can leave the car anywhere and that parking is free. And this is really interesting, where access to something can become more convenient, can provide people with more choice than ownership of a vehicle. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. So if you think about what's happening behind the BMW platform, it's really this perfect convergence of what we talk about, right? So doesn't refer to social media. I hate the word media. I hope it dies as a term. Because so many companies I talk to, one of the questions they ask me is, should I have a Facebook strategy? They are still asking that question. And what's far more interesting is to start thinking about the social trust that is embedded in these networks that we can start to use in really interesting ways. Then, of course, we've got location, where we have the ability to locate people or things so we can leave that car wherever we want to. And then, of course, mobile, which is the game changer. And it's this perfect convergence of solo mode that will transform how we can think about accessing things, that will transform how we can access anything we want when we want it through our smartphones. Now, this is where it gets really interesting to me. BMW recently, a couple of weeks ago, announced a partnership with a UK-born startup called Just Park. Now, Just Park is started as a peer-to-peer platform that would enable people to find parking. I was amazed to discover, when I was doing this research, that we waste 106 days of our lives looking for parking. 30% of all urban traffic is people looking for parking. Now, if you think about all those underutilized parking spaces, that may be at the back of schools, churches, in hotels like this, or people's private driveways, it has unutilized capacity that, again, we can use technology to unlock and make liquid. So the concept of Just Park's been around for a while, but what happens is they often struggle to hit critical mass until they're integrated into a product or a user behavior that people are used to. So let me show you a video that shows how Just Park have integrated with BMW.
To test out Just Park, we turned it on our smartphone, connected it to the car, and Just Park appeared as a function on the dashboard. It shows you parking spots in the neighbourhood, from people who are renting space to private driveways and space behind churches and pubs. The driver books and pays for a spot, and then the car's GPS navigation system takes you there.
Right.
Brilliant.
Well, there we are. So the owner of this spot has just made about £6.
£6, I think.
To me, this is truly amazing because this is the next wave. This is where the Internet of Things starts to meet the collaborative economy. And where it's so interesting for customers is that the value creation starts to become way beyond the car. It's about how can they give them access to all these underutilized assets in a completely frictionless way. So if you look what just happened in that video, there was no exchange between two people. It was just seamlessly integrated into their car. Now, parking spaces are just one example of many assets that are already in our lives that are wasted. They're underutilized. They're not at full capacity. And so waste is when the customer recognizes that they have assets that are underutilized. Now, I should say the customer can be an individual, but it can also be a business. The B2B opportunities in this space are absolutely enormous. So let me give you an example, and I know they're not speaking today, so I'll go a little bit deeper into Airbnb, because Airbnb has sort of become the poster child of the collaborative economy, and they are innovating around waste in a brilliant way. So, excuse me. To share this story, I'm going to actually tell you my personal story, and this represents my $1 million or $1 billion mistake. So the photo on the left is when I met Brian, Nate, and Joe in 2007. They were living and working in this tiny apartment in San Francisco. Now, the photo on the right is them jumping on the top of their offices in San Francisco when they just heard that they got a $10 billion evaluation. Now, you can see the difference in the entrepreneurs. It's interesting what a little bit of money can do for people. Now, the interesting thing for me was when I met these guys, they were living in this house, and I came back to my husband, and I told them the story, and I said, we should throw every penny that we have in this company. It's going to be the next Facebook. And he said it was a terrible idea. So basically, what he saw was these photos here. So I told him a story that Brian, Nate, and Joe were living in San Francisco. So Brian and Joe were in San Francisco. They had run out of money. They knew they wanted to start a business, and they heard about this massive design conference that was coming to town, and all the hotels were sold out. So they said, why don't we just go and buy some air mattresses, blow them up, put them on our living room floors, and see if anyone would book them. And they were amazed that instantly 4 different people from different parts of the world booked these air mattresses, and this was the birth of Airbnb. So when I came back and showed these photos to my husband, he said, this is a terrible idea. And the reason why he said this was a terrible idea, and he was right in many ways, but very wrong in many others, was he said no one's going to want to sleep on air mattresses. And he also said this is different from eBay, because he said eBay is an online transaction. And what's happening here is online to offline transactions. We are using the internet to get off the internet, and people won't trust one another face to have these types of interactions. Now, he was very wrong, because Airbnb is now a $10 billion company, so we don't listen to him anymore. But the point is, he did what many people do. He judged that idea for what it was in that day. All he could see was the air mattress on the floor. And what he couldn't see was how Airbnb would become this global marketplace that would basically enable people with a space to rent and be matched with people looking for a unique place to stay. And what's happened on the Airbnb platform is really interesting. They've moved into this continuum from air mattresses to spare rooms in people's houses to holiday homes. And what Airbnb saw was this core concept of idling capacity. They realized that all these spaces and homes sit empty for large percentages of the time. So the way I think about idling capacity is it's the untapped social, economic, and environmental value of underutilized assets. But what the Airbnb guys also saw was that this existed in all kinds of different properties and spaces. So igloos, there's over 2,000 tree houses on Airbnb, there's airplane hangars, there's over 3,000 castles. I stayed in this teepee in San Francisco, where the owners of the house make $26,000 a year renting out this luxury teepee. Now, the reason why Airbnb is so disruptive and frightening to the hotel industry is if you actually zoom back and you look at the business model that's going on here. And this is the same model around Uber, which I'm going to talk about. So what we're living in this age is where we can move from very asset-heavy models to asset-light business models. So asset-heavy is when you have to build the hotels, you have to own them, you have to manage the inventory. Asset-light is where you can suddenly use technology to facilitate access to all these places and spaces that never had a marketplace before. And this is why Airbnb can scale incredibly quickly, is because they have this abundant source of supply. Now, just to put this in perspective, it took Hilton Hotel 93 years to build 610,000 rooms. Airbnb built that inventory, amassed that inventory within 4 years. Now, I was speaking at a hospitality conference in Los Angeles a couple of months ago, and this guy from Hilton came running up to me. He goes, "You need to update your slides." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "We have 20 more rooms." And I said, "Yes, I think you've kind of missed the point. I'm not picking on you because I think Airbnb probably now have 100,000 more rooms. The point is, think about this asset-heavy and asset-light model." And then we got into this big and back and forth, and he said, "Yeah, but you know what? They're no threat to the hotel industry because they can't provide the services." And I said, "I think you're wrong." And this is really interesting because this is where Airbnb will go, is that this company is realizing the real innovation is not in the spaces, it's in the entire trip experience. And in order to start influencing the entire trip experience, the people that they have to focus on in the marketplace, the customer they have to focus on is the host. The host is the quality control. So what's going to start to happen is there's already, just like with eBay, you saw PayPal and many other ecosystems of supporting services, you'll start to see this service ecosystem emerging around ideas like Airbnb. So key exchange, cleaning, linen supplies, 24/7 concierge. And I think what's going to happen is Airbnb will open up its API to partners. So a bit like Apple became this ecosystem for media and entertainment, Airbnb in probably 2 to 3 years will start to become this ecosystem for innovation around tourism and hospitality. And that's the threat to hotels, because they will start to be able to provide the service of a hotel, but in someone's house or room. So let's go to the fourth disruption driver, which is broken trust. Now, broken trust is when the customer no longer trusts the big institution. And I have to be honest that this is absolutely rife in banking and financial services. Now, I think this quote sort of sums it up in that the way customers often talk about interacting with the large banks is a black box. They say that they don't really know what happens with their money. They don't know what happens when they're interacting with that bank. And it's this lack of control, this black box, that is opening them up to new forms of financial services. So, and the other thing that's happening that we're just starting to see is that as people start to become comfortable with sort of sharing their cars and sharing their homes, they start to become more comfortable with peer-to-peer financial services. So this is social lending. It's one of the fastest growing categories of collaborative finance. And social lending does work a little bit like eBay for money. So you're a lender, you're matched with a borrower, you can pick the risk of borrower. So you can basically say, I want a low risk or I want a high risk, and then that influences the interest rate that you get. It's not a direct match, so your loan is hedged to reduce the risk. In Australia, the largest platform in this space is Society One. Westpac actually, I thought, was brilliant in taking the lead investment in Society One. So this is a really good example of a traditional company trying to lean into this disruption. Now, the growth of social lending, this hockey stick growth, is pretty typical of most platforms. So this year on Lending Club, which is the US's largest provider, they will lend over $4 billion on their platform. On their board, they actually have Larry Summers, who used to be the US Treasury, and they have John Mack from Morgan Stanley. So this isn't, again, a small thing. By 2025, it's estimated that $1 trillion will flow through personal social lending platforms. Now, it's looking at this data when I was in London. This is a quote from Andrew Hordane. He is the number 2 at the Bank of England. He wasn't too popular where he said, in time, the high street banks could be replaced for personal lending functions by people like Zopa and Lending Club. Now, I think what's really interesting about these platforms is why. Why are users so attracted to the experience? And when you look, sorry, I'll just tell you this quick story. This is an example of what you don't want to do. So Wells Fargo banned their employees from lending and borrowing on any collaborative finance platform. And the banking executives were tweeting that this was a stupid thing to do because it was affirmation of the competition. So 3 months later, they had to publicly ban their employees from interacting on these platforms. But just to come back to why people are using these services, it's really interesting. They talk about 4 key things. The first thing is they talk about a very fast online approval process. The second is good interest rates for borrowers and brilliant interest rates for lenders. But it's the last point I find so fascinating, is they talk about making banking human again. And this is a really powerful part of the collaborative economy, is how technology can inject humanness and empowerment to services where humanness has got lost somewhere along the way, particularly financial services. So just to make this real for you, this is my mum. Her name is Ruth. She has been a customer of Barclays, her business, for over 30 years. She recently wanted to do something with her business. She only was asking for a loan of £30,000. She runs a business with around 10 people. And they said to her, yeah, we'll get back to you. And she called 2 weeks later, and no one had got back to her. She called 3 weeks later, and they said, you know what, this loan's going to take 5 weeks to approve. She said, but I need the capital now. So I said to her, Mum, you know what, don't bother. Why don't you go on Funding Circle and try and raise this from a pool of investors? Within 24 hours, she had her £30,000. She said to me, I will never go back to a traditional bank. And I thought it was really interesting what she said, and when we were talking about it, is she said, I could see what was happening. I felt in control and empowered in a way that I don't have when I'm interacting with a traditional bank. And it's this shift from broken trust to this feeling of empowerment and humanness that many of these peer-to-peer platforms are starting to innovate and capture customers around. So this is the way I think about this shift that's starting to happen, is that the 20th century was largely built on institutional trust. We built large companies, large centralized institutions, top-down structures, big brands, top-down marketing. The 21st century, I believe, will become defined by an era of peer trust, decentralized marketplaces, networks of communities, where the way people decide what products and services and people to interact with will require fundamentally different dynamics. Just to get into the last disruption driver, and I could spend all day talking about this one because it's so fascinating from a user experience, is complex experiences. So complex experiences is when the customer experiences unnecessary pain or frustration. When you experience unnecessary pain and frustration in your life, it makes that area ripe for reinvention. So waiting times, sorry Telstra, I know you're in the audience, when you're talking to telcos, ripe for disruption. Forgotten passwords, ripe for disruption. Those things that irk you, they will all get reinvented very, very fast. Now, taxis is an area where there has been no innovation for around 100 years, since stagecoaches were introduced. But they are full of frustration, right? They are unreliable, they're often dirty, sometimes I don't even feel safe. But my favorite, and this happened to me the other day, is when the driver is belligerent that I don't know my way. You're the taxi driver, that's your job to get me from A to B. How do you not know how to get from A to B? And so the conversation goes on. So what's happening is entrepreneurs are realizing that they can use technology in a similar way to Airbnb to transform taxis, or the way people, they don't even call them taxis, they think about it from moving people from A to B. So let me give you a couple of examples. Anyone tried Lyft in San Francisco? A couple of people, okay. So Lyft is brilliant. It's what they call an on-demand ride-sharing platform. The way it works is, say I'm standing in this location, I can request a lift, just like hailing a cab. And these blue balloons and these pink balloons pop up. I click on the balloons, I can see who the driver is, what car they're driving, and how far away they are. So when people talk about transparency and control, that's the way they're building it into their platform. I know exactly, I can choose which driver that I want. I then select the driver and I pay just like a normal taxi app. The invention is who these drivers are. So these drivers, they're not taxi drivers, they're stay-at-home mums, they are, or dads, they're retirees, they're college students, they're people who want to earn some extra money because they have a car or they have spare time on their hands. So I'm going to show you a quick video that it shows the Lyft experience and shows how it's quite different from the normal taxi experience. So if we can play that video.
What if you discovered a new friend every day and your phone replaced your car? Hi, we're Lyft. Lyft is the idea that people can be brought together through transportation. Today, 80% of seats on the road are empty. Yet getting an affordable, convenient ride when you need one isn't easy. Lyft is your friend with a car. With the Lyft smartphone app, instantly connect to friendly, reliable drivers from your community. A few taps, and you're off. We run comprehensive background checks, conduct vehicle inspections, and provide $1 million liability insurance for ultimate peace of mind. Save money, get to where you need to go, and meet a new friend. Maybe you went to the same grade school, or you share a love for homemade pizza. Let's make our cities feel small again, and use technology to bring us together instead of apart. Because getting around should be as easy as calling a friend.
Now, the thing I love about Lyft is not just the service it provides or that it's empowering all these people to make money and give lifts, it's the user experience. Now, I happen to know John, who's one of the co-founders, and he put it brilliantly to me. He said, the way we think about our customer experience is how we design happiness into every single touch point. And he said it's often the small things that people remember. So, for example, when you give a tip, or it's called a donation on the Lyft platform, and you give a nice tip, the balloons get bigger and bigger, and they pop, and it's a firework display. It's this really small moment that people remember. Lyft drivers, when you get in, you give a fist bump. You don't shake their hands or sit in the back, you give a fist back because it's a way of injecting humanness. And one of the cleverest things that they did that seemed completely ridiculous were these giant pink moustaches. So think about it. You're ordering a taxi, or not a taxi, someone's car. It doesn't have any branding on the front, so how do you know when it's arrived? So they started this thing as a little bit of a joke where they would put these giant pink moustaches on the front of the grills. And it did two things. One, you knew when that car was arriving, it was a Lyft car, but it made people smile. One of their first interactions with the brand was that they smile. And it's also had this tremendous viral effect, because when they go into a new city, everyone's saying, what's with all these pink moustaches going around? So they often become aware of the pink moustache before they become aware of the company. Now, Lyft is going through phenomenal growth. It's received around $332 million in funding. It's now in 60 US markets, and it's growing in revenue 6% a week. But it's interesting. There is a war happening, and it's a war between Lyft and Uber. Now, Uber started off as a similar platform. They started off as a slightly different platform. They started off because they realized that private chauffeur drivers often had a lot of idling capacity. They'd sit around between jobs. So again, how could they use technology to utilize that capacity? Now what they've done is they've gone into similar peer-to-peer ride-sharing verticals. Now, there's a lot of heat around Uber, and I have some issues with some of the things that they do around pricing, but they are a brilliant technology company. They are unbelievable at what they're doing. And now bear with me, because this is going to lead to a place that will make sense. They recently ran some campaigns that didn't kind of add up. So this was one that they did in New York, where you could basically, it was on National Cat Day, where if you lived in New York, you could press your Uber app and Uber Kitten would come up. And they would deliver, an Uber driver would deliver that kitten to your office to pet for an hour. this would only work in New York. I lived there for 10 years. And what happened was that demand exceeded supply. So within an hour, this message would pop up, sorry, all the kittens are currently being snuggled. Please try again soon. But it was this tremendous marketing exercise that they then used Uber Kittens to engage people in the Uber taxi service. Now, what they were trying to slowly seed was this idea that Uber in the future won't be about transportation. Uber will come to stand for something very different in our lives. So you can already see, they've done Uber Cool, so air conditioning units. It's very, very hot. It's a pain in the neck to go to Home Depot or B&Q, press Uber Cool, Uber driver comes along, installs that air conditioning unit, all done for $300 and one push of the button. Ice cream. Some of you may have seen the Messini. You can get ice cream on demand. Christmas trees, they've done. Even helicopters. You can Uber a helicopter. Now, this is brilliant. This is a company making a play in a painful, complex area of our lives, taxis, but actually building this technology platform that will come to stand for on-demand everything. Now, last night, Uber made an interesting announcement, and I encourage you to look at it. They've just opened up their API, like Facebook. And they announced this with a whole host of partners, United Airlines. So when you book a United flight, and you have your United itinerary, you can now book an Uber car when you land. Starbucks, I wonder what they're going to do with coffee. And so you start to see that the opportunities for these platforms, again, when they open up their API, is to integrate into existing services or products to transform the way that people can interact with brands. And that's the bigger opportunity. Now, the growth of Uber is truly astonishing. And I think people bark at their $17 billion evaluation. And when they bark at that evaluation, it's because they're looking at them in the taxi segment. They're not looking at this future of on-demand everything that Uber will make the play in. But if you are the taxi industry and you're saying, they're getting 20,000 new drivers a month, they've got $1.5 billion in investment, they're in 128 cities, you've got to start to ask yourself, are we having our Kodak moment? And it's interesting to me is how the taxi industry has responded. So rather than trying to innovate themselves, they're doing exactly what the music industry did with Napster. So a couple of months ago, this is scenes from across Europe of riots, or protests, I should say, that turned into riots. That taxi, I don't know why you can't see them, but taxi groups from all across Europe organized these protests, thinking this would wake the public up, that Uber was a bad thing that was going to destroy their industry. And the opposite thing happened. So on the day of these protests, you had, this is Matt Hancock, he's a very well-known MP in the UK. He, like many people, were tweeting, does anyone know details of this Uber app? It's awesome. I've never heard of it until today. And sign-ups increased by 850% in 24 hours. And this is a really important point, because when the public realizes that there is a new way, and that new way is better, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. That's what happened to the music industry. When we realized that we could unbundle and we could only have that one song versus paying $13.99 for the album, you can't reverse the story. And this is one of the most powerful things of the collaborative economy, is it's changing consumer behavior incredibly fast. And it's very difficult to accept that once it's out there, yes, it will go through regulatory issues. In many instances, it may be illegal in its first phase. But that stuff will figure itself out. And you can't reverse the story. So just to wrap up, what I've seen is there tends to be three reactions to these ideas. The first is the ostrich. The ostrich is like Wells Fargo. It's, I'm going to bury my head in the sand and I'm going to hope and pray that this goes away. Or as many leaders say, that it won't really disrupt the industry on my watch, that it will be a little trend and won't grow that fast. The second is the fighter. The fighter is the taxi industry that say, you know what, it's not going to go away, so we'll fight this with the law or regulation. And then the last opportunity is to pioneer. So how do you actually realize that this is a tremendous opportunity to transform different areas of people's lives? So I just want to finish by giving you 5 ideas that I think are ripe for transformation, regardless of any sector, incredibly focused on the customer experience that we've talked today. And I have no idea where it's done that, but we'll just put them all up. So the first is start to think about how you can reevaluate the way wasted assets can be used more efficiently. And remember, these wasted assets, they could be utilities. They could be the excess broadband that people have on their plans and they don't sell, that you could sell back to the marketplace. Think about how you can redesign customer experiences that enable people to empower each other. So think about my mum, versus going to Barclays, she now interacts with Funding Club, where people can form communities to empower each other. Think about how you can reimagine the way people can access products or services. So what BMW is starting to do around the car and their integration with Just Park. Think about how you can reinvent the ways that people can directly connect with each other. So what TaskRabbit's doing, or what Coke is doing with Manolo. Just on this one of the biggest opportunities is logistics. Thinking about how these ideas can start to transform logistics. And then the last one is probably the one that sounds the easiest, but is the hardest to do. And that's how you refine products or services to their most simplest and transparent forms. And the reason why I think this one is so hard is because at the moment, technology is still seen as this added layer. But when it is at its most beautiful and its most powerful is when it simplifies and connects people to other people or things in ways that they haven't experienced before. So when you start to hear more and more of these ideas, don't be my husband and judge what those ideas are today. Start to think about how they would disrupt a larger ecosystem. Because what this collaborative economy is about is not the multi-billion-dollar valuations. It's about a transformative lens in how we think about utilizing assets and engaging people that are no longer just consumers. They are providers, they're lenders, they're hosts, they're drivers. They're active participants in these marketplaces. And in that shift, in that transformation, there are massive threats, but there are also tremendous opportunities. Thank you very much.